Now I'd like to introduce the chair of the second panel, Mateen, I'm sorry. Harris is a junior majoring in international relations and public policy. In his academic studies, he has focused on the intertwined relationships between Western nations in Europe and non-Western nations in Asia and Africa. As a writer for the NYU Journal of Politics and International Affairs, he has also written about the roots of global conflict. Harris spent the fall 2015 semester in Berlin, Germany. He currently works as a global macro intern in the office of the president of the Euro-Asia Group, the world's largest geopolitical risk consultancy firm. In the past, he has worked at the Manhattan, USA's attorney office and as an investigative intern at a public defender's office. Upon graduation, Harris hopes to attend law school and pursue a career as a prosecutor or in international law. Harris, I pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. I really appreciate it, and once again, I apologize for the technical difficulties, but I think that's understandable in such a complex event. We've had administrators and faculty and students in Washington and New York and London and Paris and Florence all help plan and set up this panel, and we're very lucky to have Claudia, who's been running this entire show, and plenty of other people who have helped us out. So the title of this panel is Slow to React, Response to this Crisis, and this is a very dynamic issue because if you asked me or really anybody else what the responses to the crisis were 2 months ago or 5 months ago or 6 months ago, a year ago, you would get a different answer each time because the crisis has hit Europe so fast and it's shifted so rapidly. So originally, when I was in Berlin last semester, we had many people who were volunteering, who were very actively in support of the refugees coming in. It was called Angela Merkel's Willkommenskultur. And then in November, you had the Paris terrorist attacks. In December, you had large-scale assaults at New Year's celebrations in several cities across Germany and Cologne. Just in the past month, we've had terrorist attacks in Brussels. And so this has led to many different strains of right-wing extremism within European countries. This has led to an outpouring of anger towards the refugees. But with this going on, I think it is also good to know that there still is very large and widespread support for refugees in some way or another in Europe. And I think this crisis goes to show, and the responses to this crisis go to show how fragile the European Union's strings are and how easily they can be sort of torn apart. So 1 year ago, you had possibly the biggest issue facing the European Union, people would have said, was Brexit, Greece leaving the Eurozone. Today, if you ask anybody what the biggest crisis facing the European Union is, they'll automatically say the European refugee crisis, and interestingly enough, that's also based in Greece. So we'll be having three different discussions, or three different, not discussions, we'll be having three different panelists, and each one will be presenting a different topic relating to response to the crisis. Our first panelist, Opheli, Lawler, she will be speaking about the overarching response to the crisis in several different countries, about the different things that have occurred across Europe. Our second panelist will be Lara, and Lara will speak specifically about Germany. And finally, we have Rahman, who will be speaking about Greece. After our panelists' presentations, we will continue into discussion. And finally, we'll have panelists answer questions from viewers, and viewers can submit questions via Twitter or via the live stream through a form under the video. So thank you. Yes.
So I'm going to begin with the point Harris touched on, which is the kind of the fragility of the European Union. The 28 member states they're supposed to function as a unit, but however, in response to the crisis, they've kind of done the exact opposite. You have countries like Germany and who are responding as a country with kind of, some people are criticizing almost as an open door policy, but they're taking in massive amounts of refugees and kind of holding to the liberal ideas of the European Union. And then you have other countries, the primary example being Hungary, who have been punished by the EU, 3 different times reporting on asylum cases and just basically closing the borders. But it's not just Syrian refugees who are coming into Europe. It's a wide array of refugees coming in from all over the world. While the primary group is that of Syrian refugees, there are also refugees from Iraq, Jordan, I believe there's some. Many Middle Eastern and North African countries, Eritrea, Pakistan, even Libya has some of their own. Libya is a major point of exit for not only Libyan refugees, but also Eritrean refugees. Some people from even more southern countries in Africa are leaving through these points and entering Europe. And the issue is, one of the biggest policy issues is the fact that when refugees arrive in Europe, they're supposed to be processed in the first country of their arrival, which has caused issue because a lot of countries that refugees arrive in are not the countries they intend on staying, and also are not the countries who can necessarily host them. Two of the biggest entry points are Greece and Italy, as on the southern points of Italy. And so those access points are not really where the refugees intend on staying. So that's a huge issue. And then there's a lot of critical coverage of how the EU in general and then individual nations are handling this crisis. And in part of that critical coverage has been the rise of some of the more nationalistic parties in countries like Germany, Britain, England, and Greece. I think one of our later panelists will discuss Greece and probably the rise of the Golden Front. But the England's very nationalistic party has been also extremely criticized, and part of the platform that these hyper-nationalistic parties are forming their basis on is this anti-immigrant policy and the fact that migrants are going to negatively impact the economy of there's been a lot of policy that's been attempted to be amended splintering as almost 10 2014. In the wake of the Paris and Brussels attacks, and there's been increased security concerns, and a lot of politicians, especially in the nationalist parties, are using these security attacks as reasons not to allow refugees into the country, saying that they are the ones posing the security risks, and they are the ones behind. They are the ones behind the attacks, when in reality there is no for those researchers. Refugees involved. And so there's this extreme rhetoric that refugees, Muslim refugees, are going to pose a huge security concern to Europe and to the EU. And that rhetoric is even being expanded on across the ocean in the United States. American politicians are echoing these concerns. But these, like I said, these are really not based in anything factual, but you still have the Polish European Affairs Minister saying things like, in the wake of the tragic events in Paris, Poland doesn't see the political possibilities to implement a decision on the relocation of refugees. The attacks mean there's a need for even deeper revision of the European policy regarding the migrant crisis. And while it's true that there is a need for a deeper revision regarding the policies of this migrant crisis, they don't come in terms of security, they come in terms of placement, and they come in terms of how to resettle this huge populace of people into a country and establish roots and systems in place to help people who come with nothing. And so that brings in the non-governmental response, which has been organizations like the IRC and other small grassroots movements are some of probably the more popular, not popular, more effective methods of like resettling refugees and helping find a place. And in fact, in England, a lot of the resettlement camps are privately owned. They're not even governmentally owned. And that has brought its own set of issues because non-governmental, but maybe not non-profit organizations are being put in charge of settling these refugees and putting them and giving them temporary stays. And there's a lot of temporary solutions that are kind of falling flat. And as this becomes a longer, this is not a short-term issue, this is a long-term issue, as there seems to be no, like, there's in the face of trying to find, there's not going to be, no one's going to be able to go back to Syria in the next 3 years, most likely. And so in the face of that, these people need long-term solutions, and right now is what's being brought about is these knee-jerk short-term solutions from some countries, no policy movement from other countries in the EU, and other countries just flatly rejecting any sort of acceptance of any refugees. And there are some countries like Latvia the other day, only 3 women in all of Latvia wore the niqab, the full face covering veil. And there's policy to make it illegal for that to be worn in Latvia as a way of, they're saying it would destroy Latvian culture by allowing these face veils, which is ridiculous. And it's only 3 women, but that just kind of shows like the extremity of some of the rhetoric that's been brought about by EU member states who don't feel this sort of community within the EU, and they don't feel an obligation to be a part of the EU's mission to accept refugees. So you have countries on one end of the spectrum, like Germany, who are accepting, I think, almost 1 million refugees this year. And then you have countries on the other end of the spectrum, like Hungary, who are closing their borders and whose people are like spewing hateful rhetoric as a form of nationalistic pride. And so these two divides are creating, there's no way for the EU as a body to move forth policy when they have so much divide within these member states whose obligations to the EU are tenuous at best already. The UK is constantly threatening to step back from the EU and exit the EU, and situations like this are creating even further gaps. So there's a need for non-government organizations to be able to have the funding from governments to be able to do these resettlement programs, but at the time that's not being sufficient. Even organizations like the United Nations and World Health Organization and the IRC, who have like clear plans, they're setting up camps, they're trying to, like the UN has more camps outside of Europe hosting the majority of the refugees which do not enter Europe. And they're short, I think, $2 billion of funding so that they can get access, so these people don't have to become refugees who are trying to enter Europe, but they can stay in the countries surrounding Syria, and that even that funding is not being supplied. So there's the issue of funding is huge, not only within the EU and placing refugees there, who are sometimes forced to wait years. Like there's a story of one man who had to wait 8 months in a holding facility before he could be transferred to another resettlement facility, and things like that. It's a very slow process. And so funding and also the extreme rhetoric that kind of prevents progress in some of the member states are huge challenges for the EU in general.
Thank you so much, Opheli. Fantastic presentation. I think it was interesting how you focused just on the broad issues that are affecting Europe and that are affecting the refugees specifically. And so next up, we're going to be lucky to hear from Leah Wu, who will be talking specifically about what's considered in many instances, not all, but in many instances, the best example of acceptance of refugees in Europe, and that would be Germany. So Leah, you have the floor.
Germany's response to the recent migration crisis, and obviously has been under a lot of spotlight because of Germany absorbing an exceptional number of refugees. It has, just as last December, it received over 1 million asylum applications just in the year of 2015 alone, and that's more than twice of any other European nations. So it also suspended the very controversial Dublin regulations, and the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, has promised that Syrian refugees will receive extra protection, and this was also echoed. Like, this moral leadership was also echoed by the German population, who were generally very welcoming towards the refugees that were coming in. You have like volunteers assembling themselves online and distributing provisions at like the train stations when the refugees come in, and donations, etc. So next I move on to, it's actually a very interesting historical turning point for Germany, because they had a relatively hostile attitude towards the last major wave of migration the country has received in the 90s. And there were a lot of violent riots that broke out against like the Vietnamese street hawkers by the young neo-Nazis. And then the responses by the government towards these violent reactions towards the influx of immigrants were actually very inadequate. And in 1993, it actually abolished the right to asylum in Germany. So essentially, they saw the influx of immigrants as a form of heterogeneity that was seen as a threat to like the illusionary homogeneous population, which was actually a very common mindset among the Europeans post World War II. So Germany, of course, included. And then, so the response by the then very apathetic politicians and also the very xenophobic public is in stark contrast to today's Germany's response to like the recent refugee crisis. So in a way, it can be seen as like a country that's like eager to rid themselves of like the historical stain post the Nazi Germany after Hitler, and also like the last glamorous track records regarding the influx of like outsiders. Next, my paper also looked at the challenges in settling the large scale of immigrants, and the long-term outlook of the progression. So, for example, in Bavaria, which is a town in southern Germany, it received over 50,000 asylum seekers in the distribution. So the authorities have been struggling to create like over 3,000 additional school classes, so to accommodate the children that came with the refugees. And then, so obviously there's a lot of strain on the staffing, the space and the facilities in the town itself. And then, so these are just like snippets of the economic and infrastructural pressure that the country has to cope with because of the sheer scale of the immigrants. So because it has received over 800,000 just last year alone. But also on the flip side, Germany is considered to have like a comparative advantage to absorb these refugees because of the dynamic market or like the economy, and also because of its aging population. So with the provision of like relevant resources or like education, they can potentially be able to adapt to the local culture and also contribute to the economy in the long run. Yeah. So the next aspect my paper also looked at was the political atmosphere in Germany after the Angela Merkel's stance towards the refugees. So after the open door policy Germany has taken towards the refugees, there were rising support for like anti-immigrant opposition parties, and the opposition politicians, including Hans-Peter Friedrich, actually denounced Merkel's stance as like an unprecedented political mistake. And in fact, Merkel's personal approval rating also fell to like a record low of 54%. So essentially the whole response to the crisis is considered a very defining moment for her like political legacy as well as in the contemporary politics. And then moving on to like the voices on the ground. So like the German population in general, there were also a lot of voices of dissent, which is particularly pronounced among the already very disadvantaged groups, because with influx of immigrants, you have increased competition for like resources and employment. And then organizations that's against like the Islamization of the West, so including like Pegida, they have been holding like protests since last October. So these have been ongoing, and a lot of people fear that with these influx of the migrants and the refugees, Germany might be overwhelmed, because with its like culture and national sovereignty at stake, because of the sort of like Islamization, like the IS affiliations that may sneak through like the very porous and volatile borders we have today. Yeah, so lastly, look at the Germany's position and the European Union and how it's like its role in the EU. So Merkel has already called for like the quota to share refugee responsibilities among the EU nations, and so 26 out of 28 EU nations have like reluctantly agreed. So with the exception of Britain and Denmark, and then so basically Germany sees these like the whole development of the migration crisis as like that a development that requires pan-European like concerted effort, and also like certain reforms to immigration policies or asylum applications. So it's pushing for Europeanized control over the EU borders. So it requires like nations to surrender authorities over the national fronts, and also an increased union authority over with regards to like refugee admission, detention, and deportation. So obviously this has been seen as like a threat to national sovereignty and the control over the borders, especially in like the very volatile climate with the IS insurgencies and everything. So so I think 15 out of like 20 of the EU members opposed like the proposal. And the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, actually accused Merkel of this moral imperialism that she's imposing on the other EU nations. And then lastly, just as in the recent Munich Security Conference, which was held in February this year, the senior fellow at Brookings Institutions, who's Constance Staden-Mill, I think he framed it very well, that Germany is doing its best on the diplomatic front, but there's a real struggle to find pragmatic solutions and form an effective coalitions, because each country is facing like very different political pressures and sovereignty threats, or like just crippled by their economic constraints. So yeah, we have a very real challenge in how like the European Union is dealing with the crisis as a whole. But yeah, that was my presentation on Germany's response.
That was a fantastic presentation. It's great to see the viewpoint of Germany, which is one of the wealthiest countries in Europe and in the world, and how they've been able to handle the refugee crisis and what they and their leadership have done in the European Union to, in respect to this crisis. And next up, we'll hear the flip side of the European Union coin and how the European Union has reacted to the refugee crisis with a presentation on Greece, and which is one of those economically struggling countries in Europe, and which has now become the epicenter of this migration refugee crisis. So, Walid.
Harris, thank you so much, and also a very big thank you to my previous panelists, Opheli and Leah, for setting such a beautiful background to what should be a very promising conference here today. So without any further ado, I'll actually dive straight into my content point, which is essentially the Mediterranean crisis and how that has affected Greece. As Harris rightly pointed out, Greece has been the epicenter of the Mediterranean crisis, and it's my duty to first of all recognize why this has been so. Greece, as everyone here may know, is a frontline member of the European Union and the Schengen zone. It's a southeastern European country, which means that it has Turkey on the east, and to the south, it has Africa across the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea. This means that Greece has become the primary entry point for hundreds and thousands of refugees from countries like Libya, Syria, Iran, and Afghanistan. In fact, I'll throw a very quick statistic here. The International Organization for Migration has stated that thus far, since the beginning of the crisis, as many as 100,000 migrants and refugees have come to Greece. That is an enormous number. And to make matters worse, the Dublin regulation, which had been touched upon by Opheli in her presentation, puts even more burden in Greece. Why? Because the Dublin regulation states that the country of first entrant is responsible for the processing of the paperwork of the migrants and refugees. Consider the number 100,000. Greece is being tasked with processing all these paperworks and having to support all these refugees. The burden on Greece is conspicuous. You can see how this has adversely affected Greece as a whole. Before moving any further, we need to also consider the responses so far from the European Union, the Commission, the European Council, and the Parliament. Thus far, they have suggested an improved relocation mechanism, and they have also suggested an increased budget for the EU External Border Agency called Frontex. They have also suggested that they should increase the resources that are available to Greece by increasing the presence of bodies such as Frontex, Europol, and the European Asylum Support Office. While on the surface level, these measures seem very commendable, the truth of the matter is that these clauses have been very softly defined. And this means that the recommendations and the measures lack enforceability. In other words, these measures lack urgency, they lack efficiency, and they lack execution. And this is not helping Greece in any way at all. Apart from the pressures that is being harped on Greece because of the huge influx of migrants and refugees, the EU has also indirectly put pressure on Greece in numerous ways. One such would be the Schengen Agreement. The Schengen countries of the European Union has actually gone forward and stated that because Greece acts as the outermost country of the Schengen zone, it must enforce border control checks at a higher level. Thus far, Greece has said that it is trying its best, but these Schengen countries have said that Greece needs to step their game up. In other words, they're saying that because they're the outermost country, they must be the first border of security that ensures more safety for the Schengen countries. In line of that, the Schengen countries have actually extended a 3-month deadline for Greece as recently as the 12th of February, saying that, hey, Greece, if you do not step up your border controls, then we might have to exclude you from the Schengen zone. There has also been Euro threats to Greece, saying that if Euro does not bring their financial policies in accordance with measures that have been provided to them by Troika, then they would be ousted from using Euro as a currency. This can have massive, massive consequences for the European economy. A Swiss consultancy firm by the name of UBS has predicted that if Greece is ousted from using Euro as a currency, it can lead to an increase of the GDP debt ratio by as much as 200%. It can lead to an inflation of 40 to 50%, and it can wipe out the current GDP of Greece by 20%. It's also very important to kind of note the history of Greece in terms of the Euro crisis before moving any further. We all know that Greece has already been afforded 3 bailout programs by the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. And in response, Greece has agreed to implement severe austerity measures. One of the targets that Greece must abide by is to follow a 0.5% budget surplus by the year of 2016. The figure is very critical, and I will come back to this in just a minute to say how the Mediterranean crisis is actually adversely affecting Greece. By me being an econ major, I feel that it will help everyone if I can just break down the issues of the Mediterranean crisis and especially the economic implications on Greece at a micro level. I will keep this very simple and I will only focus on the figures of 2016. Let's first consider the cost side of Greece in terms of the Mediterranean crisis. The Greek ECB governor has suggested that the refugee crisis so far will cost the Greek government as much as 600 million euros. 600 million euros is a large number. In response, Greece has also calculated that throughout the entire fiscal year of 2016, Greece will be receiving as many as 446 million euros from a combined effort by the European Council, the European Union, and the European Commission. Let's do a very simple cost-benefit analysis. The cost, I have said, is 600 million, and the 8 packages are totaling 446.8 million. You subtract the benefits from the cost, and that gives us a total of 153 million in deficit for Greece. Recall that in 2016, Greece is required to maintain a 0.5% surplus. The 153 million is not helping Greece's cause at all. Also remember that Greece is the one country in the history of the world that has failed to repay the debts that it owes IMF. This cause is not helping Greece's economy at all, and it's only further tarnishing the reputation of the Greeks in the world stage. As such, we can see how the Mediterranean crisis is adversely affecting the economics of Greece. I will also quickly move on to the refugee numbers just to give the massive implications of the Mediterranean crisis on Greece. Again, I will only consider figures from 2016. So far, in just the 4 months, Greece has received as many as 154,000 migrants. Consider that it has only been 4 months. So if you want to get a rough estimate of the total number throughout the entire 2016, we can multiply that previous number by 3, and that gives us a grand total of 463,000 migrants. Again, 463,000 migrants. That's an enormous number, and that is a spike of 119% from the year 2015. What has the EU done in response? As recently as 2015 in September, the Council has gotten together and they have suggested that an improved and emergency relocation policy should be implemented to help Greece further. This policy will allow the Greeks to relocate as many as 80,000, and recall this number again, 80,000 migrants in 2 years. 80,000 migrants relocated in Greece over 2 years, where we see that the total number for this year itself is 450,000 migrants. If you do another simple calculation, that means that around 370,000 migrants are being left unaccounted for. These are the numbers that Greece has to currently face. And the EU, the European Commission, and the European bodies as a whole are doing very little to help Greece out. Even after all these pressures that have been forced on Greece, it's important to know that the Greeks have not lost hope. They have opened their arms and they have opened their hearts to the incoming migrants and refugees. So much so that 2 residents of the Lesbos region of Greece has actually been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, excuse me. But as I have said, the massive economic implications of the Mediterranean crisis, along with the weakening of the political institutions, cannot go any further. Greece needs our help right now. It needs it urgently. If this trend is allowed to continue, what would happen is this would break the tolerance level of the Greek citizens. Furthermore, this will result in an increase in xenophobia in Greece, and these are all ingredients that breed radicalism. Right now, Europe is suffering from a huge terrorist threat, as evidenced by attacks in Paris last year and in Brussels this past March. We can see how Europe itself is very fragile, and the last thing we need is Greece to fall in social unrest and chaos, which then would lead to countries like, which would then lead to organizations like the ISIS and the Taliban to bring more forces into these regions and breed more radicalism. We as a whole, not just the European Union, but as a world, cannot allow that to happen. I would just like to end this by mentioning one quote that I feel is very pertinent to Greece. This quote comes from one Kostas Eleftherios, who attends the University of Athens. In describing Greece's response to the migrant crisis, he says, and I quote, "This state, a bankrupt state, is trying to develop a mechanism to manage the largest refugee crisis in the past 2 decades." That just tells you how enormous the implication has been for Greece and how it's struggling. As such, having heard all the implications and having heard the possible future implications, it is time for all of us to stop treating Greece as economists. It is time for us to stop treating Greece from a political perspective, from a lawyer, from a journalist, or from a public policy dialogue maker. It is time for all of us to come together and act as humans in trying to face the crisis that envelops Greece. Again, Harris, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. I extend my thank you to Opheli and Leah for joining us and to the audience for listening to us. Hopefully I was able to provide some good clarifications on where Greece stands in response to the Mediterranean crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walid, for such a forceful and interesting presentation. So now we're going to be going into discussion questions and discussion among the different panelists. And so I wanted to start out broader and then focus in on each individual country, Germany and Greece, Germany being the country that has been able to handle the refugees the most, and Greece being the country that has not. Opheli, you talk about in your paper how the majority of Syrian refugees are not coming to Europe, and that many of them are, or most of them are in countries surrounding Syria, so Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, so on and so forth. But the flip side to think about this is that many of the refugees coming into Europe are not from Syria. So in Germany, you had, I believe, around 1.1 million people enter as migrants or asylum seekers, refugees in 2015, of which about 40% were from Syria, and then other refugees came from Iraq, other refugees came from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, Eritrea, places the Congo and Gambia, and so, and this isn't just for you, this is for the other panelists as well. Is there a line, at what point does Europe say these people are allowed in, these people are not? Because if we're going to be talking about responses to the crisis, one of the responses that has occurred that many people have been talking about are deportations. So you have right now weekly flights happening from Germany to Afghanistan and Sweden to Afghanistan that are just deporting people that have been rejected asylum. And so is there some sort of process, or is there some sort of framework that should be used to determine who should be able to stay and who should be able to stay, or should everybody be able to stay?
Well, first I want to touch on the numbers of how many Syrian refugees aren't coming to Europe. Only 5% at this time of the, I think it's 5 million refugees, only 5% are actively seeking refuge in Europe, while 95% are seeking refugees mainly in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Egypt, and Iraq. And so that in and of itself, like you said, is like most Syrian refugees aren't going to Europe. And on top of that, most refugees in Europe aren't just Syrian, or are the 40% are. And that speaks to a larger global issue that 60 million people in this world right now are displaced. It's the highest number. The UN has reported this is the highest number in history of displaced peoples, and those, including those who are refugees. And so it's not only Europe who's faced with this issue, but Europe specifically faced with the issue of accepting refugees from all over the world. Is there a line? Is there a should it be women and children first? Should we only allow families in? Should we not? Someone said that we shouldn't allow single men into Europe, which is first of all is ridiculous, and also according to the most recent report I read, which was I believe March 16th, most refugees being accepted into Europe, and most refugees in general, are women and children. I think it's something above the 6th percentile, and So even if you were going to play that game, the majority of people coming into these countries are women and children as it stands. So you're still going to have this huge populace of refugees within the country, within these countries. I don't really see how deportation is helping. You're taking people and you're sending them right back into the conflict areas and leaving. They're dying or they're feeling being deported from a place you sought asylum is one of the most extreme forms of disenfranchisement I can even think of. Imagine making it across the central Mediterranean path, getting into Europe, thinking that people think that the hardest part of their journey is going to be the Mediterranean, or it's going to be the desert, and there was going to be Lampedusa where you have traffickers who are taking advantage of you, and then you arrive in Europe and you're faced not only with these radical groups who are just spew hateful rhetoric at you, but you're met with the government that is inept at handling your situation. When the entire purpose for leaving where you left was that you left the government who was either purposely oppressing you or inept at dealing with your situation there. And so sending these people back, some of them, if there was this I spoke with someone who, I cannot remember the name, but they were talking about the likelihood of someone being sent back in and then joining the fighting forces. If they're deported and they're sent back in, what do they have to lose? They're not seeking asylum. They're not finding safety. And so I think Europe and other countries as well. I think that even countries further away, such as the United States, such as Canada, we all have a responsibility not only for these people, but if we have to convince governments, and we have to convince populations to do it through a selfish lens, sending people who have come from war-torn or impoverished areas who need asylum and who need refuge, sending them back into these areas is not only not good for them, it's not good for us. This is going to exacerbate issues of, there's going to be even more displaced people, there's going to be more fighting in these countries if they're not allowed to find and search for better life. So I think the question of, should everyone be allowed to say? And a blanket answer in a very general term, yes, for right now, yes. Until we can figure out something better to do, yes, everyone should be allowed to say. And that's probably not the popular answer or even the economically responsible answer. But I think from, I'm so sorry, the panelist who spoke on Greece. Really. Anyways, you said something about the humanitarian responsibility of this, beyond the economic, beyond the political, beyond the journalistic, the humanitarian responsibility and the very human angle. And I think that is going to be the thing that ultimately affects all of those other factors the most. And so I agree with you. I think the human responsibility it supersedes all other forms of responsibility.
Thank you for your answer, and I wanted to extend this out to London, but before that, yes, there's a humanitarian responsibility that, we've been seeing it our entire lives on television. Vast areas of the world, a large portion of the world that is very impoverished, that has not had the lifestyle that students at NYU or really in the United States have been able to have and the resources that they've been able to have. But poverty, this is a crisis with refugees coming into Europe, and it's been happening for a while, but it's really ramped up in the past year. And if there's a thing that, every country should be accepting impoverished people who cannot support themselves in their home country, is there a better way than the central Mediterranean route or the eastern Mediterranean route where so many people are dying? Is there a way to do it more efficiently in a way where we can align our humanitarian streams with our political and economic streams?
Harris, could you mention who the question was directed to? Okay, so I'll go for it. Thank you again for that question. I feel that in terms of having the routes being more efficient, it depends more on where these people think that they can get more security and more safety. If you consider countries like Libya or Eritrea, which are in African countries, the best promise for a better life for these countries, for these refugees, are in the European Union, not in other sub-African countries. Consider countries in the Middle East, like Syria. like Iran, Afghanistan, if you consider the geographic area, these countries are having a spillover effect of the civil wars, and this means that these refugees that are escaping these areas do not have any other option but to go to the European Union. Why? Because if you look at the statistics of the European Union over the past decade, they have a better living standard, they have high employment rates, like Leah mentioned in terms of Germany having a very proper industry, and they have a very high income rate as well. Not proportional, but compared to other regions in these distressed neighbors, in these distressed regions, European Union offers the best possible solution. So coming back to your question, Harris, in terms of having a more proper and a safe route, at this point of time, these people's primary concern is to save their lives, right? And that's why they will go for the most efficient and the cheapest way out from this misery and into a new world. And at this point, when you are faced with the concern of having your life saved and whether you will live the next year or not, rationality does not really work, right? And that's why you see that these refugees are going to the first region that makes sense for them in terms of safety, in terms of a better life. In this area, I also feel that some of the other neighboring countries in the Middle Eastern area, more specifically countries like Qatar, countries like Saudi Arabia, have a massive role to play. Why? Because these countries, by opening up their borders, can then shift some of the influx of migrants from the EU towards these other areas of the world. But unfortunately, and to much shame, these countries have totally blocked off these borders to these refugees who are in need of a better life and a better security. And so, long story short, to answer your question very precisely, I feel if we are to implement a more strategic and a more efficient way in terms of relocating these refugees, it's not just the EU that should play a very efficient role and a very productive role, but it should be these other rich Middle Eastern countries like Qatar, like UAE, like Saudi Arabia, who should also open up borders to make sure that these refugees are being accounted for and that the entire burden does not fall entirely upon the European Union, and especially periphery countries like Italy and Greece.
Thank you. Leah, do you want to continue, or we can ask the next question? It's up to you.
I thought that was very valid point, but also thought about how really if you were to open the borders between Saudi Arabia and those countries, would they actually be also other kind of conflicts right, because of the different religious affiliations just within like the community itself. But yeah, that's just like some other issues to think about. Yeah, but yeah, I think that was a very efficient.
So, discussion about Gulf states and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Kuwait, so on and so forth, accepting refugees, this has been going on, this suggestion has been going around a lot for a year now. And if you ask, or if you hear from any of the leaders of these countries why they're not accepting refugees, they automatically say, well, it's a matter of safety. We can't let everybody into our country. What if this happens and that happens and so on and so forth? And so Europe obviously has been a lot more accommodating than the Gulf countries have towards these refugees, but are these concerns that the Gulf countries have, and many people in Western European countries have, are they legitimate? What, if anything, can be done to mitigate security threats from so many people coming over from so many different parts of the world? We've already had 2 major terrorist attacks in, I believe it was the past 6 months in Europe. Is there any sort of process or procedure that can help out and maybe make the people of Europe feel more accommodating towards the refugees because they have the peace of mind to know that there aren't people who want to do harm in the midst of the refugees?
I think that the cause for concern is mostly inflated. While these 2 major attacks were extremely tragic, like we said before, there is no direct linkage between refugees. And there are extremist populations within every ideology. So I think also like the Islamophobia that has really sprouted up in Europe, especially the party Leah, I'm so sorry. Leah mentioned, I'm terrible with names, had mentioned in Germany about the party that's its entire basis is being against the Islamization of the West. These types of parties spring up out of ignorance, but this rhetoric is kind of, it's not only making it more extreme for people who are afraid of these sorts of attacks, but the people who maybe are watching this and already have these feelings of that the West doesn't accept them, that these like feelings are already being planted, they're only going to intensify. So I think one of the biggest issues actually is this rhetoric by these governments who are concerned for safety and who are targeting a specific populace for the safety concern. Terrorism is a modern global issue, and it transcends and like goes across religious, ethnic, and cultural borders. Terrorism is not one group's invention or making. It is a global issue, and so safety concerns are very real for everyone, from everyone, though. And I think that is something. While yes, these two major attacks in Europe were indeed committed by radicalists associating themselves with ISIS, that doesn't mean the next attack is going to all be associated with ISIS. There's a lot of extremism coming from this disenfranchisement I talked about earlier. And so I think in regards to that, the Gulf states will use that kind of fear and make that, expound upon that for other self-interest. I think security concerns are probably the least of these Gulf states' worries, and in terms of like the thing like accepting refugees, I think there's other factors that are motivating it, but I think that the Gulf states, the United States, and the EU, by principling security concerns, they can push aside the other concerns that are really causing a lot of the reservations, and because that's a public interest number one sort of thing, and people who are educated and who are part of the regular populace who don't have to concern themselves with these things, if they're told accepting a large population of this group of people will automatically be an infringement upon their safety, then of course most people, if someone says a spider will bite you, you're not going to put your hand in a box of spiders, and or even maybe want to be around the spider. You're probably like, the spider can say where the spider came from, but these people aren't spiders, and there's no inherent danger just by them existing to anyone. And I think that the rhetoric surrounding safety issues is doing the exact opposite of what it's hoping to achieve.
Thank you. I wanted to go into the next question because I think we are running short on time. And so this focuses really on the dichotomy between two very different responses to the crisis. So the first one is Germany, in which Germany had open borders, was free for all accepting refugees, and this was, I believe it was called moral imperialism by Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary. And now it was interpreted that Germany was almost the bully of Europe. And now you have Greece, in which Greece is being forced into a deadlock situation, having to essentially turn its country into the largest refugee camp in the world, because every European Union country, not every European Union country, but many European Union countries that aren't Germany have closed off their borders, preventing refugees from leaving Greece. And so that also is a form of, I believe, other nations bullying Greece. So if both Walid and Leah can reflect on whose role, or who's the most powerful person in the European Union, who sets the agenda for how refugees will be accepted and who will accept the refugees and where the burden goes. Because first it was Germany, and Germany is trying to place the burden across the European Union, and now it's the other countries that are focusing the burden really hardly onto Greece.
Okay. Harris, thank you again for that wonderful question. Because I have been talking about Greece, I would also kind of like want to see what the agenda was in terms of relocating purposes and who are the chief actors in taking these decisions. First off, it's very important to note, and this kind of goes back to the previous question, that in terms of the relocation system, the immense pressure that is being put on Greece is largely due to the main EU bodies, right? And if we have a very quick look at how the EU works, we consider the European Union, the European Commission, and the European Parliament, who come together and who implement these decisions. Now, in terms of the relocation purpose itself, there is one council decision that I would bring everyone's attention to. This was the 25th September resolution that was passed by the European Council, and it said that the relocation system should be expedited to help the refugees in Greece and in Italy as well. If I'm not mistaken, and I believe I'm not, the proposition said that as many as 100,000 migrants will be relocated from Greece and Italy. I just consider the following. What if Greece was not Greece and instead it was Germany? Or what if it was not Greece, but Greece was instead another powerful European country like, let's say, Belgium, or let's say France? Would these relocation numbers have been as little as they are? I don't think so. Why? Because if you consider the past of Greece, their reputation has already been tarnished by the massive euro crisis that they have initiated, right? And this has meant that their stance in EU policy dialogues has been weakened severely. They do not have like a good ground to actually make demands of saying that, okay, you know, we need more help. In fact, Greece has been asking for more help, but these pleas, we can say, have actually been falling on deaf ears, correct? And so I feel that in this process, though the European Union says that they work as a whole, if you consider the decision-making process, it's not a unanimity decision-making process. It's a QMV method, qualified majority voting. And in these votes, the countries who have the larger economy, who has the more population, have more impact and influence in making these decisions. The countries I'm talking about would be Germany. The countries I'm talking about would be the UK, and even Spain and Paris. And in terms of that, we can see that these countries actually are not, so it's kind of like a pseudo level of commitment of, to be really honest with you. On the surface level, they're saying that, okay, we are going to help Greece, we are making these decisions, we are making these proposals, but if you really look closely at these proposals, they are defined by very soft laws. They're not hardcore laws, right? And as a result, these countries can escape these policies by saying, oh, okay, you know, this policy says that we need to do this, but this is not really the case right now. And so we will not accept these relocation mechanisms, right? And we will not accept these refugees. As a result, what's happening is Greece and countries like Greece, who are poor performing countries in the EU, are being faced with this massive burden of the humanitarian crisis. And overall, the effort has been disjointed. The effort has been imbalanced, and it's just increasing the security concerns even more. Leah, if you have something to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tricky question because, I mean, whose responsibility is, it's very hard to pinpoint like a solo person, because I feel like it really needs like a considered effort, like especially like as a coalition or like as a whole European Union, or even extending beyond the whole union. But I feel like at this current like present moment, you need a coalition, but a leadership is also necessary. So for now, I think, I mean, Germany is obviously taking like the it has like the moral imperative, and also very importantly, like more of the resources at its disposal, so it's able to, I mean, economically or even in terms of infrastructure, it's able to accommodate. So those countries definitely should, and as Germany is already stepping up the game and this like in absorbing immigration, but definitely more like countries like the UK definitely should contribute more, seeing that they have the available resources and definitely the capacity to accommodate more. And a lot of times I feel like just as Opheli was saying, how the social security rhetoric is being like brought into the discussion. But one thing that I want to point out is that a lot of the like radicalized attackers in like the recent years, like the London bombings or like the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the attackers are not like refugees or immigrants. They are like London-born people who are actually radicalized in London. So they're not refugees or immigrants who have sneaked through the borders in terms of these like and under the whole influx of migration. So it's like important to rethink how we frame the whole rhetorics regarding like the security threat of like Islamization and the relation between the influx of immigrants into Europe. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for a fantastic discussion. Now it is time for Q&A from the viewers. So I believe we'll be going back to Claudia, who will be asking questions on behalf of the viewers.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for both presentations that were presented in London and New York City. It was really interesting to kind of understand exactly what these responses have been at the member state level and then the EU as a whole, and how the decisions being made at the European Union level are affecting member states. Obviously, with 28 member states, they have a lot of priorities that might not necessarily agree with each other. So it was interesting to hear all of your presentations. The question we have, and unfortunately we only have time for one, is from Kyle. And the question addressed to all panelists, but we'll start with London, is: it seems as if there's a disjunct emerging in the panelists' presentations between forms of knowledge available by statistical measures and legal or ethical demands. How do you guys in London believe we can understand the crisis and methods of its representation based on either of these forms? So either the legal and ethical demands or statistical measures. Is one more urgent to the crisis than the other? Are there ways to use them in concert to respond to the crisis?
Claudia, thank you for directing that question. And I feel like that's something that's very important right now, because on one end there is that tension of having the fiscal measures, especially in terms of Greece and the bailout system, because when they negotiated the Troika deal and the 3 bailouts, severe austerity measures were implemented on Greece, correct? And I feel like this question is more pertinent to Greece because it is one of the member states of the European Union which has to face the brunt of the migrant crisis, right? At the same time, this is a global humanitarian issue. No one has ever seen such a huge influx of migrants since World War II, correct? And at this point of time, we cannot judge countries based on what they did in their past, whether they had economic failures, whether they had political deficiencies, and we cannot treat these countries and approach the situation from a past perspective. This is a new situation, and we need to come at it with a new perspective, right? And this new perspective, as Opheli mentioned before, and Leah also mentioned, needs humanitarian efforts, needs ethical measures to approach this. For me personally, from what I have encountered, and I'll just deviate just a little bit and talk about how when I was away to Europe for a Euro trip 3 weeks back, I actually came across this 8-year-old Syrian boy who had just been successfully relocated to the Netherlands from Syria, and I got to hear about the horrors that he had to face when he was detained in the Greek camp for 3 months, right? And when you hear about these stories, when you hear about the horrors that these families have had to go through, you understand that no amount of money, no amount of political measures should be implemented. Rather, you have to approach these people by thinking about how you would have felt if you were in their shoes, right? And I feel like, in response to that, ethical measures, humanitarian measures should override economic concerns and political concerns. And I feel like if that becomes the emphasis, this migrant crisis, this humanitarian crisis, could be better resolved.
Leah, do you agree?
Yeah, I think Wally has answered the question very well, so I'll ask.
Right, thank you.
I'll kick it back to Opheli. Opheli, do you want to comment on that question?
I agree, and I do think that the numbers and the politics, they're important because ultimately, society functions through systems of economy and politics. However, I do also agree with the point previously made, which is that those systems need to work towards humanitarian issues and not the other way around. I think the humanitarian issues shouldn't have to try to fit themselves into the structures of economy and the structures of politics in the EU. That the humanitarian issues should be a goal for the economic structure to work through. And I think it's possible, and I think that the way you approach this situation will heavily affect the outcome. So I think if you approach the situation through economic and through political policy before the humanitarian necessity and for the ethical standpoints, you're going to get an outcome that doesn't really account for the humanitarian and ethical issues. But if you approach it through the humanitarian or ethical lens, the economic outcome will not suffer as greatly as a humanitarian if the humanitarian aspect were to be ignored. So that's kind of my take on it.
And I think that's a good point to end on to continue the thinking for panel number 3. I thank you, Harris, for chairing this panel, and Opheli, Leah, and Walid for being incredible panelists. Now we're going to take another 15-minute tech break while we prepare for panel number 3. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You ready? Demands or statistical measures is one. Hi everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our third and final panel for the day, Charting a New Landscape, the Impacts of the Crisis on Society. I'm curious to see where this last panel takes us. Now I get to introduce Sean Gallagher, the panel chair for this panel. Sean is a sophomore at NYU Stern, majoring in business and political economy. He has lived his whole life in Clark, New Jersey, not far from the Big Apple. Sean is currently finishing up his year abroad in London and will be studying in NYU Shanghai for the fall semester next year before returning to New York City. He's a fan of traveling, concerts, SNL, political sketches, and new food. Upon graduation, Sean hopes to work in management consulting for governmental and financial institutions before later attending law school. Sean, it's all yours.
Thank you, Claudia, for the introduction. So now we've reached our third panel of the day. We've talked at this point about the origins of the crisis and its structure, as well as responses from governments and NGOs. So now we're going to shift focus a little bit and have a more forward-looking perspective, talking about the impacts of the crisis on society. So as other panelists have explained, there have been a lot of mixed responses to the welcoming of refugees in Europe. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has been the most open about accepting refugees in the EU, pushing EU countries to open their borders. And the number of refugees seeking asylum has already topped 1.25 million people. States like Germany, Hungary, Sweden, and Austria have had huge influxes in immigration, accounting for nearly 2/3 of incoming asylum applications in 2015. Even Pope Francis has played a role in advocating for the opening of borders. Just this past week, he brought back 12 Syrian migrants from Lesbos to the Vatican, and he has been calling upon Christians to uphold their duty to help those in need. However, public opinion in Europe has turned against the welcoming of new refugees, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, where most of the refugees are heading. Opposition has been particularly vocalized in the governments of countries such as Hungary, which has the densest concentration of refugees. In fact, Prime Minister Viktor Orban has blamed the EU's refugee policy and the Schengen area for jeopardizing the security of Europe, as well as threatening the Christian fabric of European society. So as public opinion has turned against the refugees, so too have media portrayals. Statements like politicians expressing their caution to welcome refugees because of their Muslim identity, and this, of course, has associations with terrorism. This is what the statements are implying, have appeared at the forefront of news outlets over the past few months. And such generalizations of refugees have compromised their ability to maintain their individuality following their displacement. Of course, the security implications of the refugee crisis on society cannot be ignored, and the importance of this to Europeans has been highlighted by the rise of right-wing parties in stark opposition to increased migration. But so far, we've been talking about the refugee crisis mostly in terms of politics and economics. But the purpose of this panel is to shift gears a little bit and talk about the societal and cultural impacts. We have to remember that this refugee crisis is focused on people, and that is what this panel will be focusing on. So as can be imagined, living in countries with such mixed receptiveness to increased migration has been challenging for many refugees, and there have been serious cultural and societal impacts over the past year. And we'll be discussing these with three major impacts: dehumanization, an identity struggle, and a representation of the other by the media. So today we have a very interesting panel. We'll be examining art, literature, and right-wing uprisings in relation to the refugee crisis, topics which we hope will help to humanize the discussion a little bit and understand how lives are being affected by this on the daily. And this panel in particular is truly global. Myself and each of the three panelists are each streaming in from a different location in 4 different time zones. As Claudia mentioned, I'm Sean, and we have Grace Halvorson in New York City, Lara Khamisy in LA, and Oliver Jones in Florence. So I'd like to start with Grace. She's studying at the New York campus, majoring in media, culture, and communication at Steinhardt, with a minor in producing at Tisch. She's from San Diego, California, but spent this past fall semester in Florence. She's a passionate advocate for human rights, and women's rights particularly, believing creativity to be key for human progress and individual content. Grace, can you kick it off?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Sean. So to talk about my paper that I wrote, I started off in my research about the refugee crisis with looking at surveillance and the way that refugees are followed throughout their process of coming to safety out of the horrible situations that they are in. But what I found was that surveillance and the way we talk about refugees in media strips them of their humanity. And the more I started thinking about that, the more I wondered, well, how can we change that? How can we restore this humanity that we have taken from them? And so I started thinking about, well, in regular culture, like if if there wasn't a crisis happening, how would we express ourselves? How would we share our humanity with other people? And that historically and currently has been through art. So I dug a little deeper and started finding Syrian artists who are either refugees themselves or who have stayed in Syria. And one of the most interesting people who I actually had the privilege of meeting at NYU Florence last semester, his name is Issa Touma. He is a Syrian artist, filmmaker. He owns and runs a gallery in Aleppo, Syria, and collaborates with other Syrian artists on preserving the culture that Syria was before their revolution, whatever language you want to put around it. But I think it's really interesting the way that art can give back some of that humanity that has been taken away by the broad language we use, calling refugees boatloads and just saying, like, we don't look at them as people anymore. We look at them as just a mass which isn't human. And we need to figure out a way to restore that. And I think one way is through art and through perpetuating those images of art and of the individuals, the humans, the real people that are part of the masses. And I think a way to share that is through social media. We have this great moment right now to spread things that like traditional media wouldn't, and it's just really exciting, but there's a lot of work to be done. So thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Lara Khamisy. She's streaming today from LA. After graduation, she hopes to pursue a career in the medical field, and she was interested in this crisis because she's very passionate about social justice and politics. So Lara, take it away.
Hi, I'm streaming from actually the San Francisco Bay Area, but from California, sunny California nevertheless. So what I want to do today is show how this conflict is toughening the mentality of the female Syrian demographic, which is going to be extremely important in rebuilding Syria in a post-revolutionary Syria down the road. So my main question is, okay, how does culture change in a radically different survival game, migration crisis? So, and I'm looking at this from a feminist perspective. So first I want to answer the question of, how does gender equality fare in Syria right now and in the years leading up to the crisis? And a very good source on this is called, if you're interested in my talk, you should check out this book. It's called Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, by Egyptian-American journalist Monel Tahawi. So she says, and there are a few comments about Syria in here which I think are worthwhile mentioning. There was a Reuters poll that surveyed Arab states in 2013. Okay, countries in this time are obviously in uprising. And this is nothing new. In Syria, it says forces loyal to President Bashar al-Assad have targeted women with rape and torture, and Islamic militant groups completely dehumanize them in rebel-held territory. And I think a familiar story on the news is the Yazidi girls sold into prostitution by Daesh. So there's another report, Violence Against Women in Syria, Breaking the Silence, which complements the discussion I'll get to. It says, it remains extremely difficult to measure the extent of crimes of sexual violence or to draw conclusions on patterns, in particular due to the stigma surrounding the crimes. Why is that? It's because a lot of sexual abuse goes unreported in settlement territory in Syria. I mean, we're seeing this rape crisis that I want to say that a crime rate was not as high in Syria before for a Syrian population before the conflict. So I want to show how social pressures are slowly deteriorating in in Syria surrounding female issues. And there was a story that came out very quickly. I'll go over. It's how there has begun to be female soccer players in football. You know, one of the girls are saying, I don't know why some people think football is a sport for men only. You know, it was very difficult for a team to even begin in Syrian territory because of conservatism. Or transportation was established to and from stadiums. You know, we're seeing social pressures slowly deteriorate and help open this different sphere for women. Okay, and another example I want to go to is Kurdish militants. There are women fighting in combat in Syria against Islamist radicalism, and the Damascus Bureau came out with this. And I think what this is showing us is sort of role models that women are in combat are trickling down to their children who are going into this next generation and to improve gender relations in Syria. So the next question goes like this: how have their life circumstances changed from their lives in Syria to the I think an important incentive in these refugee settlements have become heads of households. I mean, not by choice, obviously, because their husbands either disappeared, have been abducted, killed by the regime, or militant groups. So there's a foreign policy essay about a Syrian refugee named Lena. She has like 7 kids. 3 of them have psoriasis, which is a skin disorder. The important point to take from this is that first income is going to like extreme needs, like medical needs. Then it's going to food provided for the children, and then it's going to the parents, the caretakers. So I mean, something she said was, I have no choice but to be strong. If I get weak, the children will be affected. So we see this this change trickling down to the children, and I mean, they're going to. I think we can look at this as a generational change if we're going to a post-revolutionary Syria. So second thing is female-headed families average 6 members in Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt. Jordan's Tari's camp, to fend off the sort of sexual predation. A woman says, "I would dress and act like a man so that my children could sleep in peace and feel safe." So, like, we're seeing a shift in sort of the way women carry themselves and are seeing themselves. Okay, and to move on, I mean, there are problems with affording basic needs, but we have to pay attention to sort of a mental health crisis that's going on. So, I mean, obviously, women doctors are needed. Women are saying, okay, look, I feel like I need a psychiatrist. They're beating their children. They're bearing the brunt of so much responsibility. So I mean, obviously, we're going to have to think about, okay, look, mental health is a pressing problem for these women. And something interesting I read is, okay, psychologists hear stories from the women and see psychologists themselves. So, I mean, the second thing we see here is the emergence of women's groups that I don't want to say are inclined to feminism, because some women are seeking approval from their husbands to join. It's downtime for women to come together for coffee, henna, and talking about their circumstances together in a very social environment, which from a psychosocial perspective is going to help their help them develop themselves. In particular, there's a drama therapy, okay, which is significant because women who didn't consider themselves artistic are using this channel. So have these motifs of feminism that Syrian women in 2016 are looking at and saying, look, I connect to this and I want more rights. A play that started production 2 years ago by playwright Mohammed Al-Adhar. The play is a collection of monologues of the dozen or so women coming from Shatila and Beirut. it's based off, it's an appropriation of the Greek Antigone written by Sophocles. He was an Athenian politician and playwright in 500 BCE. So it's about brothers Eurydice and Polynices who die on opposite sides of a Thebes civil war. Polynices is on the wrong side of battle. He's refused his burial rights, which, if you didn't know in Greek times, is the equivalent of stripping away all your human dignity because you won't be insured in afterlife. Creon, who decrees this, he's Antigone's uncle who filled the power vacuum after Antigone's father is gone. His ruling philosophy is much order and stability and censorship, eliminating the opposition, something kind of familiar to the Assad regime in the way that they treat political dissidents and artists. A very public example is when Syria made it a capital offense to be a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was critical of their secular government. So here's Antigone who wants to give burial rights to her brother. And one of the actresses says something I thought was very poignant. She says, right, tragedies keep happening throughout history, and this gave us courage to speak out. I mean, I don't have footage of the play, and there are immigration barriers that keep women from performing here in the US or in Canada. So BBC interviewed with the actresses, and one says, my brother was detained, he was taken away by the regime in Syria. I think he is dead, and I want to bury him, but I can't. I don't know where his body is. And this is the dilemma demonstrated in the beginning of Sophocles' Antigone. An article from the Daily Mail says, in one scene, a woman from Dara, where the modern Syrian protests began, recounts her experiences and elaborates that her husband ordered her to wear the full-face veil or niqab. She challenged his orders and stayed at home to avoid wearing the niqab, but eventually had to leave because her child fell ill. Her story demonstrates the magnitude of conservatism in traditional Syrian households, that husbands and men are forced to remain in control. It's a very patriarchal force that has always acted on these women. So a question rises. The question that rises is, okay, why don't women come together and revolt and simply demand their rights? And there are many things you can say in response to this, okay, from a Quranic perspective, from a global media perspective. But my view is that it's a way to maintain tradition. When your national identity as the way for women to provide. And maybe this will pave a way, a bilateral approach to the household and what women are supposed to do. You know, I don't think a Syrian woman will return to Syria and say, I want less rights. So that concludes my talk. We'll go back to Sean now.
Great, super interesting. So for our last talk, I'd like to pass it over to Ali Jones. He's a freshman in global liberal studies, spending his freshman year at Florence. He's concentrating in politics, rights, and development with plans to major in politics. He's a strong believer in the power of diplomacy, and he's a big consumer of journalistic media to fuel his knowledge of politics. So, Ali, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you, Sean. And I just want to say that your introduction in the beginning fits in well with what I want to talk about, because I want to talk about the sentiments that are currently in Europe and the people, and in particular Germany, because of how accepting the Merkel government has been of refugees and the response that has gotten. And the response has generally been backlash towards Merkel's party, which leads to growth with far-right political parties. So I also want to mention that while I do talk mostly about Germany, these sentiments and growth of far-right ideologies are seen very much in the northern part of Italy with the Liga Nord, and in France with the Front National Party. So these, while I talk a lot about Germany, this is certainly not a unique German problem, but it's just a great microcosm to talk about and contextualize this whole refugee crisis. What I want to talk about in terms of far-right growth comes from rhetoric that is seen, especially at rallies and protests, with banners, posters, and overall sentiments that have been seen with thousands of people protesting. I also want to talk about poll numbers and contextualize them based on time, looking at when the flow of refugees came in and what that led to in poll numbers starting from September till now. And I also want to talk about anecdotal evidence, just certain instances where there was evidence that far-right sentiments have grown stronger. So first I'm going to talk about rhetoric. There have been many posters and banners with thousands of people at rallies talking about how this is, in German of course, they say this is our land, Frau Merkel. And that just echoes to the sentiment that if it is our land, then it is not their land, meaning that the migrants coming in are not welcomed in Germany because their coming and their identity and their inability to assimilate according to these people leads to us versus them mentality, which is very, very dangerous when you're talking about acceptance of refugees. And this sentiment only makes far-right parties that much more appealing because they're the ones that are giving the sentiments that and the opportunity for these people to have their voice heard in parliaments. Going into that, I'll talk about the rhetoric coming from the actual political parties. Now, the political party in Germany that has represented these people interests of this is our land, migrants are not welcome here, is the Alternative für Deutschland, the alternative for Germany, but it's definitely seen as the alternative for the Christian Democratic Union, which is the party currently in power, headed by Angela Merkel, who's been in power for over a decade. Alternative for Deutschland has had many instances where they have had rhetoric that is very, very anti-refugee by saying we're going to build a wall and police and border patrol have the right to shoot refugees if they climb over this wall. Now, this rhetoric is very, very dangerous, and after this statement was made in February, party growth actually continued to rise. And regional elections in March that were taking place in the south of Germany actually gave seats to the Alternative for Deutschland after this was made. So clearly, this type of rhetoric is what the people want to hear because the Alternative for Deutschland had absolutely no seats in any regional areas across Germany to now having some seats. And this growth happened over a course of having a marginal percentage in August to getting 24% of the vote in Saxony in March. So clearly this rhetoric of the us versus them mentality, very, very inflammatory, anti-refugee, is what the German, not all, but what a lot of the German people want to hear. Because we've seen it in the poll numbers and we'll see it throughout the rest of this year. And we'll see in 2017 with the national elections whether or not we'll have this party get a seat at the national election, a party that has had rhetoric unseen like this since 1945. Anecdotal evidence. For starters, there's the instance of the false rape claim against people of Muslim or North African, Middle Eastern ethnicity that was made in Berlin that was a rallying cry for many far-right. And even though it was proven to be false and the girl quickly admitted that she made up the claim, it was almost too late to silence supporters of far-right parties because this is all they needed to hear. All they needed to hear was people were a threat to society and damaging their German girls and people. There's also an instance of, in South Germany, a former hotel that was being turned into a refugee camp was burned down, and instances of many people standing, watching firefighters trying to put out the fire, cheering. So they clearly did not want refugees in their town. They did not want to take care of refugees. to the point where arson was encouraged and destruction by any means as long as refugees were not accepted in Germany. With that, I would like to point out that while this is very alarming, Alternative for Deutschland is currently only in 3rd place. They're trailing behind the Christian Democratic Union, the party of Merkel, as well as the further left party, the Socialist Democratic Party, as well. So Alternative for Deutschland currently makes up about 14% of the general support compared to the Christian Democratic Union's 34%, and the Socialist Democratic Party, which is about 21%. These numbers are from early April. So while it is alarming and their growth is very scary, the threat is not whether or not they will dethrone Merkel or further left parties, but the threat is that they will eventually get seats in the national parliament, which is clearly a threat as they have definitely gained support and gotten seats for the first time in regional elections. So in conclusion, the general population of Germany and overall in many European states is looking to far-right parties with anti-refugee rhetoric to support their views of this is our land, not theirs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Really interesting. And I like your point about this right-wing rhetoric, and it reminds me of right-wing rhetoric that's being used in the United States right now. So I hope in our discussion we can kind of talk about that a little bit. But obviously, three very different papers, but 3 very relevant and interesting papers to this discussion about the refugee crisis. What I noticed was a similarity between all 3 was this idea of dehumanization among refugees, this struggle with the responsibility to assimilate and maintain individuality, whether there be opposition just from normal people in these in European countries or from governments. So I'd like to build upon this a little bit deeper and try to connect these papers as much as possible. So I'll start with Grace, and while this question is directed at you, it's open to all 3 of you, so feel free to comment on it. And also as a side note, we are taking questions on the website, so if you're watching online, feel free to post questions and we can address them later. But Grace, to start off with you, you gave a lot of examples both in your talk and in your paper about how Syrian refugees have been dehumanized as a result of this crisis. So I'm wondering if you think this dehumanization and manipulation of images, particularly by the media and politicians, is intentional or just a natural result of fear?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of both. It's a cycle where the images that were shown by the media are these ones that dehumanize refugees, and then because of that, we're scared, so we say, oh, that's the only image that I need of this group of people, this person. And then that cycles back again, and the media says, oh, well, this is what our audience wants. They want this image of these people, so then they keep perpetuating those images. So that's where I think social media takes it and allows us to have a little bit more of a diverse image. Social media is a little bit outside of the standard mass media audience, one-to-audience type thing. So we can have a little bit more control of the images that we receive and also that we share. And we've seen it breed diversity in many other ways outside of the refugee crisis, but I think it can especially be helpful within this migration crisis.
Okay. Great. My next question's for Lara. What I found really interesting, you talked about drama therapy in Beirut, and it's really interesting at a time when these refugees are being dehumanized you talked a lot about how it's been an opportunity for feminist empowerment for a lot of them. So my question is to explain the differences between the impending feminist revolutions that you mentioned that are starting to take place in the Middle East and how they will translate over to revolutions in Europe.
Okay, so I think with the rise of the Arab Spring, we're seeing not just an opposition to the regime, but I think a growing sentiment that we want an equality against the regime, against the house, and against the streets. It's something that Mona al-Zahawi calls the trifecta, where she says that it's not simply a woman's issue; it's also a man's issue. That to effectively and to attack a widespread oppression, we have to address it from every single angle. So, okay, what we see, or strong feminist movement. I mean, what there's a report that ranks these countries in like the bottom 10 or 20 in terms of addressing a gender gap. There was a 2005 report that came out about Morocco that touts its progressive reforms with regards to family equality and child rearing. But the reality is that it ranks 129th out of 136 on this government list. And I mean, the question that we're asking is, okay, is the international community does the international community really care about the feminist cause? So I think the way that we can address this, and the way many Arab writers, a lot of Arab writers are saying, is a grassroots movement and a movement within local communities can sort of inspire a global reaction to things that are happening in these Middle Eastern countries. I want to bring us to a Syrian novelist, Samar Yazbek. In an interview with The Guardian, she says that the real revolution will begin after the fall of Assad. Then a feminist revolution will construct a new life, a new education, and build a new family. And so, like I said at the end of my talk, I mean, these women are not going to return to Syria after having been, so I guess, half of the loaf of bread winners, I guess I'll put it. They're not only are they providing for their children in terms of their care, but they're also providing a main source of income. So I think this really is like toughening their mentalities in terms of, how resilient are these women going to be, and how much are they going to take when they return to Syria if with that end in sight. So just to conclude, I think there will be a lot of I think once the conflict calms down, and I think with the rise of, I think there's going to be a lot of tension, against an Islamic, now there is a lot of tension against an Islamic caliphate. So there's just too much right now that they're fighting for, like, a true feminist revolution. So I'm going to conclude with that.
Grace and Lara, you both made a strong case for the importance of art among refugees, both to preserve their individuality and to change their reputation among Europeans and in their portrayal in the media. My question is, in many refugee camps, particularly those in Turkey and in Greece and Lesbos, for example, they're barely sustainable, and a lot of the people, due to lack of supplies, a lot of them have had to be relocated just to survive. But there's a lot who are still stuck in these camps. So my question is, how can the administrators of these camps be convinced that promoting arts among the refugees or providing art materials to them is a high priority, just right up there with food, water, these other basic needs?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think one way to convince the administrators of these camps is that art as therapy, even if it doesn't achieve this like wider goal that would be fantastic of changing the media narrative around refugees or changing like the way that we see their humanity, there's even the like more individual reason to have art, which is for therapy. These people have gone through so much that like I can't even imagine, and I hope I never can. But there are only, in my paper I cited one example of, there's a Spanish nonprofit called Global Humanitaria who brought art therapy workshops to a hospital that was serving refugees, and that is so important. We often forget the mental health aspects of going through such a crisis because we're so focused on our base needs, which obviously you're right are very important, and if we can't even satisfy that, it is hard to comprehend trying to get resources that don't seem as essential. But I would question our understanding of what's essential in that situation, because how can we, if we just feed people's bodies but like don't allow them to thrive and don't give them the opportunity to express themselves intellectually and emotionally, then what kind of person is going to come out at the end? What person are we saving? So I think art's actually really important.
Lara or Ali, what are your thoughts?
I'll keep it short. I completely agree. Mental health is a human right. And, these people are not living dignified lives, and the least we can do is provide a basic health care. So I think we have, as from global perspective, we have to shift our views on like what's essential, what is a basic need, and drama therapy is one way to do that.
I think that a big issue regarding the whether or not to support the arts is that when you come to these refugee camps, the big issue is providing them, if they're staying in the long term, rights like education for children, rights like education for adults who have degrees from Syria, Iraq, other countries that refugees are needed. So the government is looking what is our highest priority that we're supposed to do, and from a somewhat economic standpoint, these countries would rather have these migrants contribute, and a big part of the far-right growth is that they feel as if they're contributing nothing, all they're doing is taking. So they would like to provide something or educate them so that they can provide something to the economy, and governments want to prove that, hey, these refugees and accepted them is not only the right moral thing to do, but it's also an economical thing to do with the growing and aging population, and all this talent that is sort of being wasted because they don't have the proper education or language skills. So I think that food and water are priorities, and then after that it becomes hazy. Do we provide art and drama and therapy, or do we provide education? And I think a lot of these economies, especially the German, French, and Italian economies, would rather provide education than drama therapy.
Good point. It's definitely a difficult debate. I'd like to shift focus a little bit more towards your paper, Ali. So my question for you, and of course, Grace and Lara, you can answer this as well. Do you attribute the rise of groups such as the AFD, which are in opposition to these open immigration, do you attribute this more to frustration with Merkel's policies or to the need for a new scapegoat in Europe?
I think it's frustration with Merkel because the growth is not limited to the alternative for Germany. Growth has been seen in actually Germany's Green Party, and they replaced Merkel's Christian Democratic Union in the past regional election in Baden-Württemberg. So I think the issue is not necessarily with this. Well, there is a bit of a scapegoat saying that there are some problems that refugees are causing. I think the biggest issue is that the far right and a lot of citizens feel as if Merkel has overstepped her boundaries and that there needs to be some new voice. For a lot of people, that new voice is the exact opposite of Merkel, the far right alternative for Germany. But for some people, it's the new voice is the Green Party, who is in a coalition with Merkel's Christian Democratic Union, but they just, as long as the CDU isn't at the forefront, it's a positive for these people. So to briefly answer your question, I think it comes from frustration with Merkel, not necessarily for a new scapegoat.
Grace and Lara, anything to add?
No, we can move on.
So unfortunately, we're out of time with our panel discussion, but I can pass it over now to Claudia, because I think we have some questions from viewers.
Yes, thanks to everyone on this panel for your contribution. Grace, you made some great points about spreading awareness through social media and the importance of the arts in spreading messages, like Issa Tuma with his photography and filmmaking. Lara, you emphasized the importance of feminism and the role it can play in the current crisis. And of course, finally with Ali, you discussed the influence that right-wing parties are having in creating this mentality of us versus them. All really important impacts of this crisis. And now to go to some of the questions asked by our audience. The first one is from Lawrence Macbeth, and it's for Ali. You mentioned that Europe, and you briefly touched on this, but you mentioned that Europe can go either way in moving forward with how to handle the refugee crisis. However, what do you predict will happen politically, considering parties such as the AfD are continuously gaining so much support?
Well, I think it's important to note that all of these, Germany's a coalition government, so in order to get a majority, of course, you need to align and form a coalition over 50%, and none of these parties currently in Germany are willing to make a coalition with the Alternative for Deutschland. They're too far right, and it's bad politics for other parties to align with them because it looks bad. So I think the danger of their growth is not necessarily the policies that they will enact, but what it means for everyday life. These votes don't represent necessarily policy, but it represents just the overall sentiment that's going on in society that is generally anti-refugee. So refugees that try to get jobs, refugees that try to go to school or to university, these votes symbolize something that there's a growing sentiment that these refugees won't get their opportunity because there's a sentiment against them. And these votes also show that give seats to these people that wouldn't have a seat at the table otherwise in Parliament. So their radical and somewhat xenophobic beliefs will be broadcasted and hold almost as much merit in terms of where it's coming from that Merkel's word would come from, simply because they have a seat at the table now. So I'm not scared about policy necessarily, and I don't think that they will enact anything that's too radical, but just about what a vote for them symbolizes.
Oh. Yeah, it's that rhetoric is quite dangerous, considering that it also affects refugees and their ability to integrate in the societies in which they end up. Now I'll ask a larger question. It's actually from Harris, the panel chair from panel 2, and this will open up to, we'll start with Grace in New York. what are the long-term results of the crisis? And in your opinion, in the last 10 years, what are the biggest effects that this crisis, one can say crisis, or the development of migration in the last 10 years has been on society?
Yeah, I think it's really fraught because we have, like, for example, coming from the United States, my interaction with the crisis originally was very limited. I have one friend from high school who, her family's from Syria, she has family there, or had family there, and so I kind of knew by virtue of like her being in my life that there was something going on, there was, you know, but because it wasn't a big, and this is 3-4 years ago, there wasn't a huge understanding of what was going on in Syria at that time for me, and I think for a lot of people in the US, that now we're in this like moment where there's so much awareness and such widespread awareness that we can like actually make a change and hopefully get together more people and more efforts and figure out how to maybe create policy that will sustain the next migration crisis. How are we going to handle it better than we've handled this? How are we going to help people and not strip them of their humanity at first? Like, that doesn't even have to be part of the process of a migration crisis. So I think that would be I think that can come out of this crisis, this current moment.
Lara, do you want to say something?
I'll say that I think with the refugee crisis has been a rise of anti-Muslim sentiment. I think this has been fueled from already like 15 years of fear regarding an ideology that's, I think that someone in the second panel put it, that there's extremism in every single type of ideology. But I think we see that the U.S. is reacting in a way that's that gives an umbrella sort of term to Muslims and Islam. And we can see this manifest in like the way the NYPD has patrolled mosques and Muslim neighborhoods and the ethnic communities in that northeastern area. And I think we can see this with some dangerous rhetoric from like Ted Cruz and Donald Trump regarding patrolling and securing these neighborhoods. Donald Trump lets ban incoming Muslims. So I think this has been fueled I don't know if we're going to
I think in terms of what it means for the Europe and the European citizens, I think will be seen, in particular for Germany, it will be seen in the future and with the 2017 elections and what that means, and everything leading up to that in terms of rhetoric and poll numbers. I think that especially in the United States, it's going to mean something because, as talked about in the first panel, this is a global issue. So that means that what Donald Trump is saying about Syrian refugees, it matters, and he is very much opposed to accepting them, as well as bordering the southern wall because he feels as if refugees are also going to come through there. So I think that it matters very much from a political standpoint, and the results of that will be seen within the next year and a half for America and for Europe.
I agree with all three of you, and I think another important impact, but it relates to your panel, Harris, will be the impact on the European Union, to see if it could see how it handles this, see how it survives going forward, because it's certainly been a test of the EU. I mean, the EU has had problems dealing with Greece's debt crisis, but now it also has to deal with the refugee crisis in Greece. So it's definitely going to be a test for the EU, and especially going forward, how these refugees will affect the politics in the EU, whatever their political leanings are. So I think that'll be a long-term impact of this crisis as well. So I think now we're out of time. So I think it was very interesting to have this panel, because as the refugee crisis continues, the economics and politics will, of course, be super important, but it's important to have a more cultural and societal perspective as well to keep in mind. So I'll pass it over to Claudia, but I'd just like to say thank you to all three panelists, and thank you to Claudia in particular for doing such a great job organizing this. So thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
A big thank you to all of our panel chairs and panelists for participating in the conference today. To our audience, we hope that we gave you a brief understanding of a very complex issue. The goal of the dialogue was not to come up with a solution, but to emphasize this critical crisis that the EU is currently facing. This is a conversation that needs to be continued, and we hope that moving forward, you will be a part of that conversation. Please continue to visit our website, wp.nyu.edu/global migration dialogue, for country profiles, a weekly migration blog, and student writings on Europe's migration crisis. There's also more information on the website if you'd like to contribute something yourself. Again, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation.